I'm about to go through a complete ISO 42001 compliant AI system assessment for a commercially available product. I'm going to go step by step through all the Annex A control requirements, evaluate them against the ISO 42001 standard, and identify any gaps that will drive your risk register creation. This is the exact process that we've used to help clients like LastPass, Accurus, and Rightway to build ISO 42001 compliant AI governance programs. Companies with these systems in place can manage risk effectively, build trust with their customers, and accelerate deal closure by proving the responsible use of AI. And if you don't know who I am, I'm Walter Haydock, the founder of Stackaware. We help AI-powered companies measure and manage cybersecurity, compliance, and privacy risk by building ISO 42001 compliant AI management systems and getting companies from beginning to end of the entire certification process. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what you need to do for an ISO 42001 compliant AI system assessment. You'll also understand how to evaluate third-party risks and build trust with your customers, regulators, and other stakeholders that you're using third-party AI systems responsibly. Let's get into it. So, first of all, what is an AI system assessment? This is a consolidated way in which you can capture a range of Annex A requirements from ISO 42001 in a single assessment. So if you're looking at this slide here, this shows you the various different things that are captured in a system assessment. It has things like Annex A.3 from roles and responsibilities, AI resources from A.4, lifecycle from A.6, use of AI systems from A.9, and data for AI from Annex A.7. So there are a whole lot of different controls that are incorporated in a system assessment. And unfortunately, ISO 42001 is somewhat overlapping and duplicative in its requirements. So with an AI system assessment, we take these various requirements and address them all at once when we are going through a third-party product. To give you a little better idea of exactly how this works, we're going to go through a control mapping against the AI system assessment. So what you have here is a set of color codes. So things in green are administrative controls implied by clauses 4 through 10. Things in orange are additional administrative controls. Things in blue are focused on data governance. Those in gray are technical controls. And then things in purple are covered by an AI system assessment, which is exactly what we're going to go through today. And then things in yellow are AI model assessments, and things in brown are AI impact assessments, which we won't touch on in this video. We'll save for another one. So diving into the mappings here, we're looking at this column, the AI system assessment, and you can see this tackles quite a few of the controls in in Annex A controls, A.3, A.4, A.6, a little bit of A.7, and 8 and 9. So this mapping will be available in the description, so check it out there if you are interested. And with that, we are going to dive into the AI system assessment. So the target for our review today is going to be a product called Develocity from Gradle Technologies. And this is something that real-world organizations are using, and they want to make sure that it fits into their AI governance and security requirements. So what I'm going to do is go through step by step in the Stackaware AI System Assessment Register and identify the relevant characteristics for this AI system and document them and then compare them to the AI governance standard. So as far as what the AI governance standard is, this is a set of requirements that Stackaware has documented for AI systems, and we have 3 tiers of evaluations that we perform. For public data, that's going to be the lowest level of scrutiny. Things that process confidential data are going to be the next level of scrutiny, and then things that process high-risk data or operate in high-risk circumstances are going to have the highest level of scrutiny. And the reason we do this is because ISO 42001 requires that organizations establish criteria for AI systems in certain respects. And what we're doing is we're bucketing these requirements into these 3 tiers of public data, confidential data, and high risk. So Gradle Develocity in this context is a confidential data processing system. It's not a cyber-physical system, and it's not specifically regulated by a given jurisdiction. And unless the CISO or whoever in your organization is in charge of this decides that it is high risk, then we're going to treat it as a confidential data processing system. Okay, now that we've defined the AI governance standard, we're going to go through line by line and compare the system that we're evaluating to the standard and confirm or deny whether it meets our requirements. So if you go over to the AI System Assessment tab, we've got it set up for Gradle's Develocity. We've got some things that are inherently relevant. For example, the asset number, that would be a system assigned value if you're a Stackaware customer, but this is just an example, so we won't put anything there. You can see that we have an asset definition. That's if it were a high risk AI system or something of that nature for according to Colorado SB 205 or the EU AI Act. Doesn't apply here. We're going to assume that this is the verification and validation lifecycle stage, and there are no parent assets to include here. But if this were a third-party generative AI service like OpenAI and that was powering the underlying system, then that's something that we would include here. All right, so getting into it, we have the first column here, which is the purpose and intended use of the AI system. So this is critical for Annex A control requirements 6.2, 8.2, and 9.4, because you need to understand what a system is defined for before you start using it. And according to our standard, a system can only be used for the documented purpose by the developer. That's different than something that falls into the public data tier. And, if that were like a marketing tool or something like that, where you could potentially have a little bit of leeway in how you're using it, you may not necessarily be using it exactly how the developer documents, and that's okay for public data tools, but that is not okay for confidential data tools, according to our standard. You may have a different requirement for your organization, and you can feel free to tailor this to exactly how you want to operate AI systems, but this is a baseline that has worked, and Stackaware will continue using this because it's worked for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to, check out Develocity, and we can see, okay, so, it gives you visibility into test builds and CI/CD pipelines, so you can measure, troubleshoot, and optimize the impact of AI code. So, what we'll do is I'll take this and I'll just say, according to the vendor. And, it's important to have some objectivity here. And, something that I know auditors have commented on is that you can't just take exactly what the vendor says at face value. So something that I found useful to do is to, look up like G2 reviews or, third parties that are evaluating a given AI system. So, something that we'll look at is, for example, we have like the G2 reviews here, which are on this screen. And you can see, it has some star ratings and we've got some user comments here. This is an interesting observation right here is like the interface being buggy. That's definitely a foreseeable misuse or foreseeable failure. So that's something that I'll definitely record as part of this assessment. So I'll say, according to one G2 reviewer, the interface can be buggy, which could cause system failure. So these are the types of things that you would want to source directly back to the information or directly back to the page where you're getting this. The way Stackaware does this is we use a archive.org snapshot of every source of information, and that's automatically appended to the system register. So I'm not going to do that now, but you definitely want to cite back to the sources that you are using. So, a hyperlink would be appropriate, but a better way to do it would be to have kind of like an enterprise data management system for handling all these things. And that's something that Stackaware does on your behalf if you are one of our customers. By the way, if you're watching this and realize that your own AI systems have gaps similar to the ones that I'm finding here, this is exactly where Stackaware can help. We were one of the first ISO 42001 certified companies globally, so this is not theory for us. We know exactly how to do this in the real world. If you need help building your own AI management system, click the first link in the description below. Okay, so for repair, update, and support capabilities, this is where we start having firm requirements when it comes to our AI governance standard. This corresponds to Annex A Control 6.2. So things we're going to look for are security patching, timelines. So let me take a look at that, see if they have any sort of policies. So something that we do have that is quite relevant is some Develocity security advisories. So this is actually a really good piece of evidence that shows that the company is providing, support for its product. So this is definitely something that I will add to the assessment. I'll say, Gradle provides velocity specific security updates and, flags specific, or flags, potential risks publicly for customer review. And this is relatively sophisticated notification scheme. Something that is here. Yeah, this is pretty clear support policy. So, I'd add another entry saying that the system vendor provides a dedicated support policy and clearly explains what is covered and what is not in terms of vendor support. Okay, so that is some good information there. We've kind of met that it does provide security updates. It would depend on our risk appetite and vulnerability management policy, but it's likely that it meets our requirements here. So there's no risk, no issue so far. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to reliability, observability, logging, and monitoring. So this is where looking at things like the service level agreement would be helpful. So for example, go to Gradle, Velocity, service level agreement. That's something that I'm just looking up right now. Well, here's what I found is we do have, this provides clear kind of severity levels and service level commitments and things like that. So this is a very, very detailed support policy, and it was also updated recently, about 2 months ago. So I think we are all good here. Something to say is, Gradle commits to specific response times as part of its service level objectives matrix. So this is tagging the reliability side of things. What I'm looking through is through the Gradle terms of service to see if there is any sort of availability commitment contractually. So this is a pretty bold disclaimer of really any warranty. So, they disclaim any statement that products will be secure, timely, uninterrupted, or error-free, that they'll operate with any hardware systems or data. So this is actually kind of a pretty big negative, because while they do have this pretty clear support policy, they are also disclaiming all of these things in their terms of service. So that's definitely something that I'm going to note as part of this assessment. So essentially, I'm just going to copy their relevant disclaimer. I'm going to say that, this is a pretty bold statement here. So I'm going to say, according to the vendor, I think this does actually create a risk, because this doesn't meet the fail secure requirements, because it says that it's going to be they don't meet any sort of requirements related to reliability, to timeliness, quality, or even that is free of viruses or other harmful components. That's a pretty bold thing that could violate this requirement here. So this is something this would trigger a risk on your risk register. There's an entirely separate video where we talk about how to go through the Stackaware AI risk register, so we're not going to get into it there, but this is something that violates the requirement when it comes to the AI governance standard. So we would log a risk against it. Okay, so now we're getting into transparency, explainability, and interpretability. So the requirements here are that a reasonable human interacting with the system must understand he or she is doing so. This is pretty clear that this is an AI system. It'd be a developer that is using it. So I'm pretty confident there. Additionally, some data lineage or overview or the third-party AI models used are identified. So this is something that some companies don't actually do, is explain what models they are using, which kind of makes it difficult to assess the transparency, explainability, or interpretability if you don't even know what the underlying model is. I'm just doing a search for that. Gradle, Velocity, AI models. It says they use machine learning. So they don't really say what they're doing. Okay, uses AI. I don't know that they actually mention which models they are using here, whether they're proprietary or, yeah, so that's something that I will note as a risk. Okay, so one thing I'll say is while the vendor notes it uses artificial intelligence and machine learning in the system, it does not provide details about the underlying models used, third party or otherwise. This makes it impossible to evaluate the transparency, explainability, or interpretability of the outputs. Now, let's see if they have any sort of like mitigations here. Yeah, I mean, because they identify the meaningful failures. I mean, these features are helpful to note, so I'll just add this in here as kind of a mitigation, With that said, according to Radel, now this can make it easier to interpret model outputs, even if it is difficult to explain them. Good. All right, so here we're going to look at accountability and human oversight. So making sure that it doesn't seem like there's any automated decision-making related to confidentiality of information. Retrieval augmented generation doesn't really seem like they're doing it, but I'm going to do a quick check. I'm just Googling retrieval augmented generation. Yeah, so there's nothing, doesn't look like they are doing any RAG. So this next we look at the accountability here. This is, I'm going to guess that there are some pretty stiff terms in their terms of use. So this is something I'm going to drill down on quite a bit here. So this is their up-to-date terms of use. So if you say, okay, this is actually not a terrible indemnification, because it's only related to, anything not permitted by this agreement, acts or omissions of the customer. So it's actually not terrible. And there's a two-way indemnification. So that's actually decent. There is a mutual indemnification that is limited to customer omissions and mistakes. So that's reasonable. Also, something to look at on the accountability side is human oversight. So, something that Gradle is emphasizing here is balancing human and AI-driven development. So it seems like they are, pointing out how humans will be in the loop. There'll be human oversight of AI code. Yeah, so I think there is a good focus here in terms of what the company is doing. They're not advocating or facilitating any automated decisions related to confidentiality and emphasizing human oversight. So definitely something that I will note. The vendor advocates for human oversight of AI generated code, which implies ultimate accountability lies with human developers. All right, fairness. I think this is a relatively easy one, in that there aren't any real issues here. So, because this is a AI coding tool or AI testing tool, so there are no real human fairness issues here. It would be important if there were any sort of automated decision making about natural people involved, anything involved with employment, things of that nature would trigger a fairness analysis. But this is something that I think we can just say there are no material system impacts to fairness. Okay, so moving on to data classifications and sources processed. There are no AI governance standard requirements. You can only process data for which the system is certified, but the system processes sensitive intellectual property such as computer code and automated tests, but does not generally process personal data we can just leave it there. All right, retention and disposal. This is where it gets interesting. And I think a lot of focus here is both looking at retention and disposal policies and also training. So this is something where I will go into the terms of use for the vendor. And that is often where you see the training mentioned. So I will look for things like improve, train, sometimes training materials, that's not the right thing. Look for artificial intelligence. It doesn't really look like there's any kind of carve out that says anything about training on customer data, because that would be a red line for many organizations. Just taking another look here. Yeah. So, that's generally okay. Saying that the feedback is confidential information of Grail. Yeah, questionable. But yeah, it doesn't say that they're training on confidential information. I think that, de-identified data is generally okay, but I would say there's a risk that de-identification could fail, especially in the case of intellectual property sensitive situations like computer code. So yeah, I'm gonna ding them on this. I'm gonna say that this is in fact a risk, because there's the risk of de-anonymization failure, especially with sensitive intellectual property. So that is something I'm going to record as a risk, according to the vendor's terms of service. We'll just grab this whole thing here. While aggregation and de-identification are privacy-focused controls, they generally do not and cannot remove trade secrets or similar confidential information. This could potentially expose it to third parties not authorized to see it. Okay, so that is a risk that we have identified here. Okay, so getting into usability and documentation. So the Gradle API is very heavily documented. There's a full Develocity API user manual, so we're pretty good here. This meets the requirement that, they're all internet exposed APIs are documented, clear descriptions of data processed. That is, I think we're good here. Competence and expertise required. So this is actually split by lifecycle stages. So this meets the Annex A 4.2 and 4.6 requirements from ISO 42001. And this is what we're doing here is we're evaluating the requirements of the system and then you can compare that to what you have in your organization. And that will tell you whether you have an issue or not in terms of the expertise required. So what we're going to do here is track or document kind of competence requirements if you're using the system. So, I think it's safe to say that, Develocity requires moderate developer proficiency, knowledge of automated testing procedures, as well as common failure modes for both software applications and AI systems. Okay, moving on to software required for design development. This is a Stackaware requirement. It's not applicable to every organization or wouldn't necessarily be, but we track the deployment steps in our Jira filter. Something to do here would be to look at the subprocessor list. So that would be a good kind of one-stop shop for all the resources for design, deployment, so on and so forth. So that's something I'm going to take a look for. Gradle subprocessors. Doesn't appear to be something that they necessarily share publicly, which is that's a little bit baseline. If you look at so we know they use Kubernetes, cloud native. They've got a bunch of stuff. Iron Bank. Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, they don't really say. Okay, also they would Trustpilot portal, cloud security. Yeah, they don't really say what the design or the resources are. Okay, here their subprocessors. So they do list all their subprocessors here, and then some other things to look at are are there hardware requirements, or there things like that. But I think this is primarily a cloud software product where we'll focus on the subprocessors here. So we'll say Gradle provides a comprehensive list of its sub-processors on its trust center. And then this is related to physical location. This is not a hard requirement that, every organization needs to look at its own requirements. So you may have some data sovereignty or residency requirements. Something to look at here is that, it is good to know that it lists all the locations where the data is stored. So it says, it's basically USA, EU. Yeah. So I'd say, I think this is the most expansive range of locations. So what we'll do is add this here. We'll say, Gradle processes data across a range of locations documented in its trust center, notably. Yeah, I'll throw some commas in here. I'll just say the United States. And yeah, this should be, this covers it. So I think, just kind of hitting the high level requirements here. And then the key is comparing this to your own organizational requirements, making sure that if you, have a requirement to not send any data to Asia Pacific, then that you're not doing so. But, that will need to be determined at the organization level. And then kind of the last thing here is to look at the health and safety impacts. So this is mostly applicable to those high risk systems that are cyber physical in nature. And, if there's a potential for human life or safety to be impacted, as well as, if there's protected health information involved, then that's definitely important to note. I'll say here that, there are no immediate, impacts to health or safety from system use. With that said, a system can improve safety for cyber physical systems through more comprehensive suite development. Yeah, what we've done is we've gone through line by line and we've identified the key requirements that map to ISO 42001 Annex A, and we've tracked them in the form of the Stackaware AI System Assessment Register, and we've done that for the Gradle DevVelocity system. And this is a way that you can use a structured approach to evaluating third-party software. We've taken in some outside information as well. We haven't just relied on the organization to provide all the data, although we did rely heavily on their representations. Obviously, if you have additional information, if you have things like SOC 2 reports, if you have third-party risk assessment tools, these are absolutely key inputs to use. We're limited in what we can do in a YouTube video to public data, so we were using websites essentially to pull this information. And if that's all you got, that's all you got. So that gives you a good start for doing an ISO 42001 compliant AI system assessment. So there you have it. That's the full process for an ISO 42001 compliant AI system assessment. But here's the thing. By itself, it won't do much for you. What you need is a fully ISO 42001 compliant AI management system. If you're interested in learning how to build one, check out the first video in the panel above. And if you want Stackaware's help in building an AI management system for you, then click the first link in the description.